Hello everyone, my name is Masito and today I will deliver you a presentation about language and discourse analysis. Before coming to discourse analysis, first of all, we need to know the meaning of discourse, and then after that we can discuss some other terms that can be related to discourse. What is discourse? Usually, discourse, if we translate it into Indonesian, mean as wacana. So, what is discourse? Discourse is actually anything we use for communication, or to communicate, or to interact in the community. It can be the form of spoken, anything that you speak, or in the form of written, anything that you write. When we talk about discourse analysis, that is actually the method of analyzing the structure of our communication. So, by doing discourse analysis, we are going to analyze the structure of our spoken language and also the structure of our written language. Here is a clear explanation of each key points from James Paul G's book entitled An Introduction to Discourse Analysis, Theory and Method, along with the examples. First, it's about the definitions of discourse. G's distinguishes between two types of discourse, with small d discourse and also big D discourse. In small d discourse refers to everyday language use like conversations, written texts, or speeches. But in big D discourse refers to broader social practices, values, and identities that language helps create and sustain. As an example, being a scientist or teacher involves specific way of speaking, acting, and thinking. The example of small d discourse is teacher giving instructions in class. Okay, student, open your books to page 10. The example of big D discourse, the entire practice of teaching, which includes not just the words, but also the rules, behaviors, and expectations associated with being a teacher. Next, theoretical foundations. G's approach is interdisciplinary, combining 3 points. The first one is linguistic perspectives, how language works structurally, as an example like grammar or syntax. And then sociocultural perspectives, how language reflects and shapes social identities and cultural norms. Third, critical perspectives, how language is used to maintain or challenge power dynamic in society. As an example, in political speech, the choice of words, freedom, security, reflects linguistic structures, conveys cultural values, and may reinforce power relations. As an examples like positioning and one group as protectors and another as threats. Then come to the third part, tools of inquiry. G's provides tools for analyzing discourse, such as context, grammar, and intertextuality. In context, G's understanding the situations in which language is used. If it talks about the grammar, it means that examining how word choices and sentences structures influence meaning. If it talks about intertextuality, it is mean that how a text references or builds on other texts. Example, in context, the customer saying, "I'll have the usual." Makes sense only if the waiter knows the customer's habit. In grammar, saying he didn't succeed versus he failed conveys the same ideas but with different connotations. Intertextuality. A news article referencing a famous speech like "I have a dream" add layers of meaning to the text. Then we comes to the fourth, methodology. G outlines a process for conducting discourse analysis, like data collection, gather facts, conversations, or other language samples. Transcriptions, gather facts, conversation, or other language samples. Transcription, accurately transcribe spoken language, including pauses, tone, and emphasis. Analysis use the tools of inquiry to interpret the data, focusing on how language constructs meaning and reflects social practices. Well, actually, there are still a lot more about these explanations. But before that, let's stay tuned and see the videos about the discourse analysis. Check it out.
In this video, we're going to unpack the sometimes tricky topic of discourse analysis. We'll explain what it is, consider its strengths and weaknesses, and discuss when and when not to use this analysis method. So what exactly is discourse analysis? Well, simply put, discourse analysis is a qualitative analysis method that looks specifically at the subjective underlying meaning of language in written or spoken communication within the context in which it takes place. To break that down a little more, a good discourse analysis will interpret language in the appropriate social, cultural, political, and historical background so as to draw out its meaning. That language data could be taken from interviews, speeches, group discussion transcripts, or even recordings. In other words, discourse analysis can be used on both primary and secondary data, making it quite a versatile analysis method. Does that sound a bit fluffy and conceptual? Let's look at an example to make it a little more tangible. Discourse analysis could potentially be a useful approach if you were, for example, researching people's perceptions of government policy on immigration. In that case, you might analyze the use and meaning of particular words and phrases taken from interview transcripts in the contemporary socio-political context. The idea would then be to identify and analyze the intended meaning of those words, rather than just their definition or frequency. As you can see, discourse analysis allows you to go deeper than just the surface-level themes, as you might do with thematic analysis, or to observe the frequency of words or phrases, as you might with content analysis. Instead, its focus is squarely on meaning within context. Now that we've laid down some foundations, it's important to understand the two main ways in which you can approach discourse analysis. Specifically, these are the language in use approach and the socio-political approach. Each of these works a little differently and sounds a little worse than they are. So let's break down what they mean. First up is the language in use approach. Here, your analysis will focus on the technicalities in the use of language, such as grammar, syntax, and phonology. With this approach, the idea is to analyze how the finer details of language are used and manipulated within the context of communication. Let's look at an example to make this a little more tangible. The English language has a relatively inflexible subject, verb, object syntactical structure, producing sentences like Sarah, the subject, wrote, the verb, a research paper, the object. So, if an English speaker were to say something like, the paper that Sarah wrote, a language in use analysis might investigate the function or effect of that sentence structure within a particular social context. For example, a politician might deliberately bend or break the rules of formal English syntax when speaking about a certain topic or in a certain context, and then adopt formal syntax in another. Here, a language in use analysis could reveal that particular speech patterns reflect assumptions about power, privilege, and class disparities between the speaker and their audience. Okay, now that we've looked at the language in use approach, next up we've got the socio-political approach, which is sometimes also called the social constructivist approach. More accurately, we should say approaches, as there are a few potential routes within this category. Here, we get closer to the philosophical roots of discourse analysis, but don't worry, we'll cut through the complexities. One of the most common socio-political approaches is known as critical discourse analysis, or CDA. The main concerns of CDA are the use and dynamics of power and power relations. This kind of analysis is inspired by the philosopher Michel Foucault and his work on how language reflects power in society. For Foucault, almost all language tells us something about power and how it's used. That's all a little heavy, I know. So let's look at an example of CDA in action. Let's imagine your research aims to explore the opinions of university students regarding their professors by analyzing recordings of their lectures and communications. In one scenario, you might find that professors' thoughts and opinions are often treated with deference, respect, and authority, reflecting a kind of normalized power. This is the type of power that's expressed and imposed almost without anyone noticing because it's built into students' assumptions about professors. Conversely, in another scenario, at another university department, for example, you might find that professors openly chastise students for speaking out of turn, which would reflect a form of repressive power. In this case, power is actively asserted and easily identified. Either way, critical discourse analysis would allow you to investigate the use of language and context to better understand power and its dynamics. So, to recap, discourse analysis can be undertaken using either a language in use approach, where you're focused on the technicalities of language, or a socio-political approach, where you're interested in the use of language to express normalized or repressive power and its dynamics. Now that we have a clearer view of the different approaches available within discourse analysis, it will be useful to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of this analysis method so that you can make the right choices for your research project. One of the main strengths of discourse analysis is the range of different types of information that it can incorporate. This includes speech transcripts, written records, interview responses, as well as non-text-based data types like audio recordings. This versatility allows you to develop a rich data set by using a variety of sources, which means you'll have a broader substantiation of your analyses and findings. Another benefit is that, almost by definition, discourse analysis highlights the nuances and contextualizing factors of your data, meaning your analyses and findings can have real-world implications for your research area. Additionally, discourse analysis can provide insight into how language is used to construct social reality and how it reflects social hierarchies, power dynamics, and ideologies. All that said, just like all analysis methods, discourse analysis has its weaknesses, and it's important that you understand these so that you can make the right decision for your project. First, there's the problem of interpretive expertise. Since discourse analysis focuses on investigating language, it relies on the researcher's familiarity with the language understudy. In other words, if you're going to analyze the use and manipulation of language to affect or change meaning, it's essential that you have a strong understanding of that language. This can even be true even within one language, since the same English words can mean very different things in different countries. Also, if your data includes information that has been translated or edited, there is a risk that the meaning will quite literally be lost in translation. The second weakness of discourse analysis is the related issue of reliability, or the subjectivity of how your data is interpreted. Since discourse analysis relies almost entirely on the researcher's interpretation of the data, the findings and the conclusions won't always be empirically verifiable. Of course, discourse analysis isn't meant to be perfectly objective, given its focus on meaning. But it is important to make sure that your project's aims, objectives, and questions allow room for interpretation if you plan to use this method. Last but not least, it's important to recognize that discourse analysis can be very time-consuming. Although this type of analysis could be conducted by a team of researchers, organizing and maintaining interpretive consistency can get tricky. So, if you're considering using discourse analysis, make sure that you have factored in sufficient time to really dig into the data deeply. Qualitative analysis of any sort almost always takes a little longer than you expect. Okay, so now we've covered the strengths and weaknesses of discourse analysis, it's important to discuss the question of when. In other words, when exactly would discourse analysis be appropriate, and when wouldn't it be? As a qualitative method focused on analyzing language and context to derive meaning, discourse analysis is usually most appropriate for research topics that are focused on social, political, or cultural phenomena and how they change across communicative contexts. For example, research aimed at evaluating changes in social attitudes to poverty might look at political speeches or newspaper articles to identify nuances in the use and manipulation of language around welfare, homelessness, and unemployment. Specifically, a language in use or socio-political approach to discourse analysis could then be used to investigate the technicalities of the language used in these cases, or the power dynamics that the language reflects. On the other hand, if your research is more narrowly focused and is not concerned with analyzing the meaning of language use, then discourse analysis would be less relevant. For example, if your research involves evaluating consumer responses to a new product or determining management methods for employee professional development, those research aims might be better suited to a more focused and verifiable analysis method, such as thematic analysis. If you'd like to learn more about alternative analysis methods, such as thematic analysis, content analysis, or narrative analysis, we've got a wealth of free information over on the Grad Coach blog. We'll include the link to that below this video. All right, that was a lot. Let's do a quick recap. Discourse analysis is a qualitative analysis method focused on meaning, as derived from the analysis of language in context. As we explained, there are two approaches to discourse analysis: the language in use approach, where the focus is on the technicalities of how language is used, and the socio-political approach, where the focus is on the normalized or repressive power dynamics reflected in language. Just like all analysis methods, discourse analysis has a particular set of strengths and weaknesses. Based on those, discourse analysis is generally most appropriate for research that's focused on interpreting meaning as expressed in the use and manipulation of language in context.
Okay, so that is the explanations from the video, and then we go to the next. When we talk about the language and discourse analysis, so it means that we also talks about the connection between language and discourse analysis, which is deeply interconnected, as the discourse analysis focuses on studying how language is used in real-life contexts to convey meaning, construct social identities, and influence relationships. They're also about more detailed about their connections. As an example, that language as the foundations of discourse. Language is the primary tool through which discourse is created and communicated. It included spoken, written, and non-verbal forms of communication. And then language reflects and shapes social contexts. Discourse analysis explores how language reflects social norms, roles, and power dynamics. And then it also shows how language shapes the way people think, behave, and interact in specific cultural or institutional contexts. As an example, like language used in the courtroom, Your Honor, objection reflects the formal hierarchical structure of the legal system with reinforcing those rules and norms. And then language constructs meaning in context. Language does not exist in isolation. Its meaning depends on the context in which it is used. Discourse analysis, that is how people use language to construct meaning, negotiate identities, and achieve goals in specific situations. As an example, the phrase "that's cool" could mean approval, indifference, or even sarcasm, depending on the tone, context, and relationship between speakers. And then language as tools for power and ideology. Discourse analysis investigates how language is used to assert power, maintain control, or challenge authority. It reveals the ideologies embedded in language and how they influence societal structure. As an example, political speeches often use inclusive language like "we" and "our" to create a sense of unity, while subtly promoting the speaker's agenda. And then language and also an identity. Discourse analysis examine how people use language to construct and express their identities, both individually and as members of a groups. It explores how language choices signal belonging, status, or alignment with certain values. As an example, a teenager using slang like lit or fam signals their identity as a part of youth culture, while a professional might use formal language to align with workplace norms. So, language is the raw material of discourse, and discourse analysis is the study of how this material is shaped, used, and interpreted in a specific context. Through discourse analysis, we can understand not just the structure of language, but also its dynamic role in social interaction, identity formation, and power relations.
Let's explore discourse analysis, a field of qualitative research that studies how language shapes our behavior, beliefs, and social interactions. The central premise of discourse analysis is that language is always used within a specific context and from a certain perspective. This is why discourse analysis is often referred to as the study of language in context. After all, we adapt our language in different contexts. Consider how we talk with a teacher and how that might be different from how we talk with a close friend, or how politicians use misleading doublespeak to mask inconsistencies between what they say and what they do. And when meeting with new people, think about how we use language to build our identity from scratch. Discourse analysis examines how language functions in real-world situations. It looks at the words we choose, our body language, and how that language influences multiple things: our thoughts, actions, and relationships, how we identify ourselves, our understanding of the world, and the power dynamics that shape us. But what is discourse analysis exactly? Discourse analysis is a language tailored to social contexts and different situations. Our words and body language combined are what enable us to share our thoughts and ideas, build relationships, influence others, and make sense of the world. Let's look at some questions you might ask in discourse analysis. One question could be, how does language construct identity in different contexts? You could also ask, how does language negotiate or influence power? How does language create and maintain reality? How do frames of reference influence language interpretation? Or how can language promote social change? Asking these questions can help show how our relationships can shape our language and vice versa, and how language presents different perspectives and worldviews that influence social reality, power relations, and identity. Let's move on to some different types of discourse analysis. Discourse analysis is a broad term that covers a large group of methodological approaches, including narrative analysis, conversational analysis, critical discourse analysis, and rhetorical analysis, amongst others. Let's look at how discourse analysis operates in these different approaches. First, narrative analysis delves into how stories, their structure, and their content shapes our worldview. For example, you might study how the story of Christopher Columbus is told in different cultures. Moving on to conversational analysis, this approach explores daily conversations, focusing on details like turn-taking, gaze, and body language. Conversation analysis examines how these elements contribute to social goals, like relationship building or conflict management. For instance, your study might analyze the delivery and timing of spoken words in a job interview. Nonverbal cues like body language, gaze, and turn-taking can help you figure out how social status influences negotiation. Next is critical discourse analysis, which is interested in how language is used to construct and maintain social inequalities. It also considers how language can be used to challenge and resist social oppression. Here, you might study how politicians use divisive language in a campaign speech. Think us versus them, or haves versus have-nots. Finally, rhetorical analysis dissects how language persuades, informs, and entertains, delving into the speaker's intent, audience, and strategies. This includes examining rhetorical devices, like metaphors and rhetorical questions. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, the metaphor of a promissory note is used to expose government hypocrisy, showcasing how such rhetorical tools evoke emotional responses from the audience. These approaches do occasionally cross paths. For example, narrative analysis and critical discourse analysis can both be used to look at how language is used to construct identity. Or conversation analysis and rhetorical analysis can be used in tandem to examine how language is used to negotiate power relations in social interactions. So you aren't restricted to a single approach if using two will lead to better insights. But keep in mind that using two or more will require a larger time investment. While these approaches can be used together and overlap in what they're looking for, each maintains a unique focus and a priority that offers a different way to frame the process. Now let's look at two different categories of discourse analysis. All of the sub-approaches we've covered fall into two larger buckets: language and use approaches, which focus on linguistic aspects of what we say, and socio-political approaches, which explore how we use language to help us get around in the world. Language and use approaches focus on the linguistics of language use, such as grammar, syntax, phonology, and structure. The aim is to dig into the nitty-gritty of language, how it's used, spread, and even manipulated in different social situations. For instance, in a 2013 conversation analysis, Lee and Buyan used conversational markers by coding conversation transcripts. They coded these conversational markers according to their function, such as turn-taking, overlap, exhalation, and disagreement. They analyzed how this language is used to negotiate meaning and construct knowledge. Sociopolitical approaches take a more philosophical stance. They are more concerned with how language constructs and sustains societal power dynamics. And don't let the name fool you. Sociopolitical methods are not restricted to political issues. There are many other applications too. As a non-political example of sociopolitical approaches, this 2021 paper examined 180 ExxonMobil climate change communications. These communications showed how the corporation relies on climate risk rhetoric and consumer demand to downplay climate change, normalize fossil fuel consumption, and shift responsibility back onto individuals. Before we segue into the steps of discourse analysis, let's look at a simple mental model to frame how it works. There are three main steps to discourse analysis. First, you contextualize your data. Then you look at the structure of it. After that, you pull out and dissect smaller pieces of data called discursive statements. On the outside layer lies the context. Every interview, document, or text is situated within some context, whether it's cultural or otherwise. For example, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, the context is the civil rights movement in the United States in 1963. Moving in one more layer, we encounter the structure of the text. While the structure consists of discursive statements, these statements are part of a larger rhetorical structure. In our example, the larger rhetorical structure could be the full transcript of the speech. At the center of the model are the statements themselves. In this example, the statement could be the actual segment from the speech. Now that we've covered context, structures, and discursive statements, we'll dive into how you actually analyze discursive statements, which are the building blocks of discourse. James Gee.
Okay, so that is all my explanations about language and discourse analysis. I hope that everything will be clear. Thank you very much and goodbye.